The attack on Cylon Outpost. Ela's heart raced as the sensors aboard Cylon Outpost emitted a piercing alarm. Her fingers flew across the control panel, scanning the incoming data. A fleet of unidentified vessels was approaching rapidly, and their trajectory indicated an impending assault. The Harkons, their enemies for as long as anyone could remember, had arrived. Cylon Outpost, situated on the edge of the galaxy, had been a strategic location for the Cylon people. Despite its advanced defenses, the Harkons had a notorious reputation for their relentless tactics and superior firepower. Ela had witnessed firsthand the destruction they could bring upon an unprepared force. Her voice cut through the chaos in the command center as she barked orders to her team. Battle stations, now. All units, prepare for impact. Her command was swift, but the fear in her gut grew as the vessels neared. The Harkons had never been so close to Cylon before, and the outpost wasn't equipped to handle an attack of this magnitude. The defenses had been built to withstand small skirmishes, not an all-out invasion. She quickly calculated their odds of survival. Slim to none, but she couldn't afford to panic. Lives were depending on her. Within seconds, the first salvo of Harkon fire hit. The impact sent shockwaves throughout the outpost, rattling the walls and causing the ground beneath Ela to tremble. Explosions erupted in every direction, shaking the entire facility. Fires broke out, and the sounds of alarms blared incessantly. "Defensive shields are failing," one of her officers shouted, his voice trained with fear. Ela's eyes darted across the command center as she assessed the damage. There was no time to waste. The Harkons were not just attacking, they were obliterating everything in their path. The Cylon fighters scrambled to retaliate, but their enemy was too strong, too fast. Harkon ships cut through their defenses with precise, deadly force, each blast sending shockwaves that rattled the very core of the outpost. Ela grabbed the comlink, her voice calm but urgent as she ordered, "All remaining fighters, engage the enemy. Do whatever it takes to hold them off." Her team was brave, but their resolve was being tested by the overwhelming force of the Harkons. She knew that if they didn't receive help soon, they would be completely overrun. Desperation clawed at her as she made the toughest decision of her life. "Activate the emergency beacon," Ela ordered. Her voice quivered, but she remained focused. "Send a distress signal. We need help. Now." She watched as the transmission began to send, reaching out into the vast unknown. "This is Commander Ela of the Cylon Outpost." Her voice echoed through the void. "We are under heavy attack by Harkon forces. Any assistance would be greatly appreciated." Her hand shook as she released the transmission. The thought that this could be the last thing she ever did crossed her mind, but she pushed it aside. They still had a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. The battle raged on, and Ela remained at the heart of the storm, fighting to protect what little was left of the outpost. Outside, the Harkons pressed forward, their ships advancing relentlessly, their weapons tearing through the Cylon defenses with terrifying efficiency. The once pristine outpost was now a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the distant sound of explosions. Ela ducked as another blast rocked the command center, sending shards of metal and debris flying across the room. She felt a sharp pain in her side and gasped as blood soaked through her uniform. She gritted her teeth, determined not to show weakness. Not now. The Cylon people were depending on her. As the fight raged on, Ela's mind raced. She had heard stories of human bravery, of a species that had risen from the ashes of its own world to become a force of nature. Humanity was known throughout the galaxy for its resilience, its ingenuity, and its determination to survive against all odds. Ela clung to that hope, desperately hoping that help would come in time. Back aboard the human starship Ulysses, Lieutenant Marcus Reed was monitoring the ship's communication systems as part of their routine patrol. Everything had been calm, almost too calm, as the ship drifted through the quiet sectors of space. He didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. His crew had seen their fair share of challenges, but today seemed to be just another day in deep space. Then, without warning, a distress signal appeared on his console. His eyes widened as he analyzed the transmission. The signal was faint, but it was unmistakably urgent. "This is Commander Ela of the Scylan outpost." The voice crackled through the static. "We are under heavy attack by Harkon forces. Any assistance would be greatly appreciated." Marcus' brow furrowed. He quickly checked the ship's systems, confirming the coordinates. The distress signal was coming from an uncharted region of space. His pulse quickened as he understood the gravity of the situation. The Scylan people were facing an assault unlike anything he had ever heard of, and they were asking for humanity's help. "Captain Hayes, we have an incoming distress signal," Marcus reported, his voice tinged with urgency. Captain Nora Hayes, a seasoned leader with years of experience navigating the complexities of space warfare, strode into the command center. She reviewed the message, her eyes narrowing as she processed the implications. "The Scylan system. We've never had direct contact with them before," she said thoughtfully, tapping her fingers on the console as she weighed the options. "If the Harkons are involved, this could be disastrous." Marcus nodded, a sense of urgency rising within him. "We're the closest ship, Captain. If they don't get help soon, they'll be wiped out." Captain Hayes took a deep breath and looked out at the stars, her mind calculating the risks. She had been in many battles before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than ever before. After a long pause, she made her decision. "Set a course for the Scylan system," Captain Hayes commanded, her voice resolute. "We'll investigate and see what we can do." The engines of the Ulysses roared to life, and the ship accelerated toward the Scylan system. A feeling of dread hung in the air, but alongside it was the hope that humanity might once again prove its strength in the face of overwhelming odds. As the ship sped toward the Scylan outpost, both Ela and Captain Hayes knew one thing for certain: the fate of an entire civilization rested on their shoulders. The arrival of humanity. The Ulysses cut through the vast, empty stretches of space like a cutting-edge blade, its engines humming in rhythm, with the urgency pressing on Captain Hayes and her crew. For all their advanced technology, there was something raw, visceral about this mission. The distress signal from Scylan outpost was the first of its kind they'd ever received from the isolated planet, and the more they approached, the heavier the weight on their shoulders became. Time was running out. "We're approaching the Scylan system," Marcus Reed announced, his voice steady despite the tension in the command room. "ETA, 10 minutes. Captain Hayes, ever the strategist, stood motionless for a moment as she stared out at the view of the approaching stars. The vastness of space always seemed to ground her, but today it felt different. There was something undeniably perilous about this mission. They weren't just heading toward an unknown threat. They were heading to a desperate cry for help from an entire civilization. "We've got the message," she said softly, almost to herself. "But we don't know what we're walking into. Let's prepare for every possibility." Marcus nodded, already tapping into the comms system to bring up the tactical readouts. The Scylan outpost was located on the outer rim of the system, surrounded by little more than asteroid fields and a handful of nearby moons. There were no large planetary defense systems in place, and if the Harkons had already breached their defenses, it would be a bloodbath before they even got there. "Shield levels at maximum," Marcus ordered, his fingers flying over the controls as he fed the ship's data into the tactical system. "Weapons on standby, just in case." As the Ulysses descended towards Scylan, the planet's atmosphere slowly came into view. Dark clouds swirling ominously over the surface. Something felt off. The usual calm, blue glow of a thriving outpost was replaced with a dim ashen hue. The surface looked scared, burned, as though the planet itself had already begun to give up. "Scylan outpost is still active," Marcus reported, breaking the silence in the room. "But barely. I'm seeing multiple breaches in their outer perimeter." The sensors flickered for a moment, and then the image of the Scylan outpost appeared on the screen, floating precariously in space. It was a vast facility, a monument to the ambition and determination of the Scylan people. But now it appeared ravaged, with chunks of debris drifting around it, and the faint outline of several Harkon ships surrounding the station like vultures circling a wounded prey. "We're not going to make it in time for a peaceful negotiation," Captain Hayes said. Her voice hardened. "Prepare to engage if necessary. Let's see if we can't break their formation." With the command center now fully prepared for action, the Ulysses broke through the planet's atmosphere, its powerful engines sending ripples of energy through the air as it made its approach. It wasn't long before the ship's sensors picked up the Harkon fleet, massive, imposing, and heavily armed, as they always were. But this time, there was something else in the mix. Something smaller, something vulnerable. A transmission came through just as they entered weapons range. It was Commander Ila's voice, gruff but filled with a faint hope. "This is Commander Ila of Silan Outpost," she said, sounding breathless. "I repeat, we need assistance. The Harkon's air." Her voice was cut off by the unmistakable sound of an explosion, and for a moment, the transmission was lost to static. Captain Hayes' heart sank, but she quickly refocused. "Target the Harkon ships closest to the station," Hayes commanded, her voice steady as she gripped the armrest of her chair. "We're not here to negotiate. We're here to save lives." The Ulysses shifted into attack mode, weapons systems primed and ready. The crew braced themselves, every eye on the viewports as the Harkon ships grew larger and more menacing in their sights. The crew had trained for moments like this, but there was no preparation that could prepare them for the scale of the attack they were about to face. The first volley of fire erupted from the Ulysses, striking the Harkon ships with pinpoint precision. Sparks flew as their shields flickered under the pressure. The Harkon fleet retaliated immediately, launching a barrage of deadly energy blasts that sent shockwaves across the Ulysses hull. Shields holding at 85%, Marcus shouted as alarms blared throughout the ship. "But they're starting to breach." Captain Hayes clenched her jaw. The battle was not going in their favor. Yet, she knew the stakes. The lives of every single soul on Silan Outpost depended on this mission. She couldn't fail them. "We need to buy time," Hayes muttered. She turned to the weapons officer. "Fire again. Concentrate fire on their lead ship." A series of powerful blasts rocketed out from the Ulysses, this time more concentrated, aimed directly at the Harkon flagship. The result was immediate. The ship began to break apart, debris flying in all directions. For a moment, the battle seemed to slow, but Captain Hayes knew better. The Harkons were relentless. "Pull us in closer," she ordered. "Deploy the boarding teams. We're going to disable their command center from the inside." The Ulysses surged forward, its engines humming with all the power they could muster. As they drew near the Harkon fleet, a series of docking hooks extended from the Ulysses, locking onto the nearest Harkon vessel. The crew's hearts raced as the first wave of soldiers, clad in armored exoskeletons, prepared to board. Ila, on the other hand, was watching from the Silan outpost as the battle between the Ulysses and the Harkon forces raged overhead. She had no illusions about the outcome. She'd been trained to think like a soldier, but even that couldn't mask the bitter truth. Their outpost was on the brink of collapse, and every moment of resistance felt like a battle for survival. But just as despair began to set in, she saw the unmistakable shape of the Ulysses enter the fray, its weapons blazing. It was humanity, the one force that had always stood out in her mind, standing tall even against the most powerful enemies. "Commander Ila," a voice crackled through her communicator. It was Marcus, aboard the Ulysses. "We're here. Hold tight. We've got your back." Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. The Harkons were far from defeated, and time was still running out. The Ulysses couldn't hold the line forever, and she knew that the true fight had only just begun. The boarding teams hit the Harkon ships with full force, cutting through the enemy lines as they worked their way toward the command center. Ila could hear the sound of gunfire and explosions in the distance, knowing full well that the battle for Silan had entered its most dangerous phase. As humanity's forces clashed with the Harkon invaders, The fate of both the Scylan people and humanity itself hung in the balance. Would they survive the onslaught, or would this be the end of an entire civilization? The heart of the beast. The chaotic roar of battle outside the ulces faded as the boarding teams made their way through the Harken vessel's tight, winding corridors. The hum of weapons, the hiss of gas, and the clang of metal against metal created a rhythm of war that seemed to pulse in time with the hearts of every soldier aboard. Each step the human forces took inside the alien ship was a step into the unknown, an unpredictable, treacherous place that threatened to swallow them whole. Captain Hayes stood at the helm of the Ulysses, her fingers clenched into fists as she monitored the progress of the boarding teams. The Harkons were powerful, calculating, and resourceful. Every step the humans took seemed to provoke a counterattack, but Hayes wouldn't allow herself to entertain doubt. The Ulysses had been engineered for this very moment. They had to succeed. Team Air reports entry into the Harken Command Center. Marcus Reed's voice came through the comms, breaking the silence that had settled in the command room. Minimal resistance so far, but we're expecting heavy fire soon. Team B is making their way to the power grid. Keep moving, Hayes ordered, her eyes narrowing as the ship rocked from a sudden barrage. Don't let them regroup. We've only got one shot at this. Back on the Harken ship, the boarding teams were making rapid progress, but the closer they got to the heart of the ship, the more hostile the environment became. The corridors narrowed and turned at odd angles, as if designed to confuse and disorient. Some of the crew had never been on such an alien vessel before, and every new twist in the design threw them off balance. But it was not the architecture that posed the greatest danger. It was the Harkons themselves. A sudden thundering explosion rocked Team A's position, and soldiers were thrown against the walls by the shockwave. The oppressive weight of the alien ship's interior closed in as the humans staggered to their feet. A moment of silence passed before the unmistakable sound of Harken footfalls echoed down the corridor. It was followed by a crackling voice on the comms. "Stay sharp," Captain Hayes warned, her voice slicing through the static. "We've located the command center, but they know we're coming. Prepare for contact." Through the ship's internal communications, a crackling, alien voice came over the team's comms. It was distorted, like static trying to disguise an intelligence beyond human comprehension. "Your effort is futile, humans," the voice mocked, its tone cold and unfeeling. "This war is already decided. You cannot defeat us. You cannot save the Scylan people." The message sent a chill down every soldier's spine. The Harkons had never been the type to taunt their enemies. They were brutal, tactical, and efficient. The very nature of the message unsettled the team, and they knew this was only the beginning. The doors to the command center slid open, revealing the heart of the ship. Inside was a vast, circular chamber, lit by pulsating, organic lights embedded into the walls. The center of the room held a towering structure, like a dark monolith, which seemed to hum with a strange, otherworldly energy. The walls of the command center were covered in strange symbols and alien script, none of which the humans could decipher, but all of which exuded a menacing aura. Standing in the middle of the room were three towering Harkon commanders. Their skeletal, armored bodies glistened with a dark sheen, and their alien eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue. They were waiting for the humans, as if they had expected them to arrive. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the sounds of the soldiers' breathing and the hum of alien machinery. One of the Harken commanders stepped forward, its voice a deep, resonating growl. "You have come far, humans, but this is where your journey ends. The Scylan outpost will fall, and your people will know their place." Captain Hayes clenched her jaw and gave the order to engage. The team moved swiftly, charging forward as the Harken commanders unleashed a barrage of energy bolts. The soldiers ducked and fired back, their weapons sending streams of blue light hurtling toward the alien invaders. The Ulysses crew was well trained, but the Harkons were a formidable opponent, graceful, deadly, and strategic in ways that human forces couldn't anticipate. "Keep them off balance," Hayes commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to disable their command interface. Now." The soldiers fired in tandem, their weapons synchronized as they focused on the heart of the room. The alien command console. Every blast that struck the console seemed to be absorbed by its black surface, as though the ship was alive, feeding off the energy that the humans were trying to use against it. As the battle raged on, the Harkon commanders seemed to grow more powerful, their movements increasingly fluid and precise. One of them lunged at a soldier, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. The soldier fired in self-defense, but the energy bolt seemed to have no effect. With a swift, brutal motion, the Harkon commander reached out and threw the soldier across the room, sending him crashing into the wall. "We're losing ground," the soldier's voice crackled over the comms, fear evident in his tone. "We need backup now." "Get to cover," Hayes barked, her eyes scanning the room for any possible way to gain the upper hand. The situation was slipping out of control. The Harkons were too strong, and their technology was beyond anything the humans had encountered before. Suddenly, one of the Harkon commanders turned its attention toward the team's leader. Its glowing eyes locked onto Captain Hayes, and in that moment, she felt a surge of unease. There was an intelligence in those eyes, something more than just the usual alien arrogance. The Harkon spoke again, its voice lower and more menacing this time. "You think you can defeat us, Captain. You think humanity can stand against us. You are nothing but an insect crawling at our feet." Without warning, the creature unleashed a devastating energy pulse, sending it toward Hayes. Her reflexes were sharp, but there was no escaping the blast. The energy surged through the room, and in that instant, Captain Hayes was thrown backward, crashing into the wall behind her. Pain shot through her body as she struggled to regain her senses, but she refused to stay down. "Captain." Marcus's voice rang through the comms, laced with concern. "Are you all right?" "Captain, respond." She gritted her teeth and slowly pushed herself up, blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. The sight before her was chaos. Her team was being overwhelmed, and the Harkon commanders were advancing. But then, in the distance, a strange hum filled the room. The vibrations came from deep within the heart of the Harkon ship, the monolith that had stood as a silent sentinel in the center of the command room. "What's that sound?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice uncertain. "We don't have time to figure that out." Hayes snapped. "Focus on the objective. We're not leaving without disabling their control systems." The hum grew louder, vibrating the very walls of the command center. And then, with a deafening crack, the monolith split in two, revealing what had been hidden within. A pulsing core, alive with energy, radiating an intense, almost unbearable heat. The soldiers stared at the core, realizing with horror that it was the power source that was fueling the entire ship. "This is it," Hayes muttered, a mix of determination and dread in her voice. "We have to destroy that core, or we all die." As the Harkon commanders closed in on her team, Hayes and her soldiers prepared for their final stand. The fate of the Cylon outpost, and possibly the entire human race, depended on whether they could destroy the heart of the beast. But as the room began to quake, a new realization struck. Their battle was far from over. It had only just begun. The last stand. The vibrations from the core reverberated through the entire Harkon vessel, shaking the walls and sending waves of energy rippling across the command center. The Ulysses team was on the brink of collapse, each soldier pushed to the limit of endurance. The Harkon commanders were no longer just enemies. They were a force of nature, relentless and inexorable. But the mission remained clear: destroy the core or risk the annihilation of the Cylon outpost and humanity's very existence. Captain Hayes' bloodied hand gripped her weapon, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself against the violent shaking. Her heart raced, each pulse of the ship's tremors beating a rhythm of impending doom. The monolith's ominous hum echoed louder, like a death knell marking the end of time. "Captain, we can't hold them off much longer." Sergeant Marcus Reed's voice crackled through the comms, his breath labored and strained. "We need to take that core out now." She looked around the room, seeing her team battle against the tide of alien forces. Some had already fallen, their lives snuffed out by the sheer power of the Harkon commanders. Others were bruised, bloodied, but still fighting, unwilling to let the sacrifice of their comrades be in vain. "We don't have a choice," Hayes said, her voice firm despite the pain coursing through her body. She stood, taking a deep breath as she watched the last of her soldiers fend off a Harkon warrior. The fight was impossible. But as her eyes locked onto the heart of the ship, the core, glowing with a menacing pulse, she realized they didn't need to defeat the Harkons to win this battle. They just needed to destroy the source of their power. Hayes pushed forward, her steps slow but determined. "Get to the core," she ordered. "Cover me while I get close. We're going to need everything we've got left." As she moved through the battlefield, the sounds of war seemed to fade into the background, her mind focused solely on the task at hand. The pulsating light of the core seemed to call to her, its energy radiating waves of heat that made her skin burn. Every step she took felt heavier, but her resolve never wavered. The core represented everything the Harkons stood for: power, control, dominance, and it had to fall. The soldiers moved with purpose, forming a protective perimeter around Hayes as they pushed toward the center of the room. The Harkon commanders seemed to sense their intentions, and their attacks grew fiercer. The energy blasts, sharp as knives, sliced through the air, grazing the soldiers and causing explosions of flame and debris. "Captain, take cover," yelled Sergeant Reed as an explosion sent a shockwave through the room, knocking him to the floor. Hayes dove behind a nearby console, heart pounding. The core was closer now, only a few meters away, but the Harkon commanders were relentless. They advanced with terrifying precision, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in their way. The team was scattered, and the clock was ticking. "Get to the core, now," Hayes barked, crawling forward as fast as she could, ignoring the pain in her legs. She could feel the heat intensifying, as though the core was growing stronger with every passing second. The room around them was becoming a furnace, and the temperature was rising dangerously. Through the haze of smoke and fire, one of the soldiers, Private Diaz, managed to plant an explosive charge near the central conduit that led to the core. She activated the detonator, but the Harkon commander closest to her saw the movement and hurled a bolt of concentrated energy directly at her. "No," Hayes screamed, her voice echoing through the chaos. But it was too late. The energy struck Diaz, sending her body crashing to the ground in a violent flash. The explosion meant to disable the core was snuffed out in an instant. "Diaz!" Private Harris cried, rushing to her fallen comrade's side. But there was no time to mourn. They were losing the fight, and every second counted. Hayes' thoughts raced. The core was their only hope. They had to find another way to reach it, or all would be lost. She scanned the room, her eyes darting across the harrowing scene. Her heart sank as the last of her soldiers fell, leaving her alone in the center of the room with the advancing Harkon forces. But as she looked back toward the core, she noticed something strange. The core was no longer just glowing. It was pulsing erratically, its energy flickering like a heartbeat. And the longer she stared at it, the more she felt an unnatural pull, as though the core was responding to her presence. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate, unorthodox plan. She turned toward the comms and spoke urgently. "Reed, listen to me," she said, voice low but urgent. "I need you to activate the backup power systems for the ulces. I'm going to overload the Harkon power systems by using the ship's own energy. I know it's a gamble, but it's our only shot." "I hear you, Captain," Marcus replied. His voice crackled with static. "Just tell me what to do." Hayes didn't hesitate. "I'm going to need all of the power focused on this section of the ship. Do it now. I'll handle the rest." With no time to waste, Hayes turned and sprinted toward the core. As she neared it, she felt an overwhelming presence wash over her, as though the Harkons were watching, waiting, calculating her every move. But there was no turning back now. With a final push, she hurled herself into the center of the glowing energy field. Her fingers reached out, and with a desperate grunt, she activated a sequence on the central terminal, a device she had no idea how to use but knew she had to trust. It was the final gamble, the last hope to save humanity. The ship shuddered as a cascade of energy began to surge through the walls, reverberating in waves that rattled every bone in Hayes' body. The core started to crack, fissures appearing along its dark surface. The Harkon commanders screamed in unison, as though they could feel the destruction building. It was working. The Harkon vessel trembled as the power systems began to overload, sending shockwaves through the ship. The core's energy continued to pulse violently, and the entire ship began to lose its cohesion. The walls buckled, the floor beneath Hayes' feet started to crumble, and sparks flew from the ship's fractured machinery. A loud, screeching noise filled the room as the Harkon core gave one final deafening pulse. In an instant, the ship exploded in a fiery inferno that consumed everything in its path. Hayes was thrown backward by the force of the blast, her body spiraling through the air before crashing against a shattered console. Everything went black. The price of victory. The silence after the explosion was deafening. Hayes slowly became aware of her surroundings, her consciousness dragging itself from the depths of unconsciousness. Every inch of her body screamed in pain, but there was something else, something far more profound weighing on her mind. She could feel the remnants of the Harkon vessel around her, twisted, fractured, burning, but she couldn't tell if it was real. The world felt as if it were in slow motion, the broken wreckage around her a surreal landscape of debris and smoke. Her vision blurred as she tried to push herself up from the cold metal floor, her hands trembling. The ship was a ruin, the once mighty Ulysses now a skeletal husk of scorched metal. Sparks and flames were scattered across the wreckage, flickering like ghosts of a past battle. Yet, through the haze of destruction, Hayes heard something that made her blood run cold, a distant, low hum. The core, it hadn't been completely destroyed. With a sense of dread creeping up her spine, Hayes forced herself to her feet. She swayed unsteadily, pain flashing through her legs as she took a few faltering steps toward the source of the hum. As she moved, her mind raced, remembering the plan, the gamble they had taken. They had succeeded in breaking the Harkon power grid, but had they truly stopped the threat? Was the core enough to stop the invasion? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? She stumbled over the wreckage of what had once been a communication station, her breath ragged. But as she moved forward, she noticed something else. The hum was growing louder, more intense, and there were strange flashes of light that flickered in and out of existence, as though the ship itself was being held together by sheer force of will. The Harkon power core was unstable, but the energy still pulsed through the ship like a living thing, feeding off what little remained of the Ulysses systems. Hayes clenched her jaw, a cold sweat forming on her brow as the realization hit her. They hadn't destroyed the heart of the enemy. They had merely wounded it. A groan of tortured metal echoed through the shattered corridors as Hayes made her way to the control center. The walls were buckling, sections of the ship already decaying, but the center of the ship, where the heart of the enemy's technology lay, was still intact. And that was where she needed to go. With each step, Hayes' resolve hardened. They hadn't come this far to fall short now. They hadn't sacrificed so much only for their efforts to be in vain. The people of the Scylan outpost and every human on this planet depended on her, and she would not let them down. Her comms buzzed with static, followed by the strained voice of Sergeant Marcus Reed. "Captain, come in. Do you copy?" Hayes winced at the sound of his voice, her heart pounding. "Reed, is anyone alive? What's the status of the crew?" There was a long pause before Reed's voice crackled back through the static. "We've lost most of the crew, Captain, but a few of us are still here, alive. I don't know how, but we're still hanging on. We're regrouping near the secondary power room. But the ship, it's collapsing. "You've got to hurry. If you don't stop the core, we're all finished." Hayes' mind raced. She had to act fast. The Harkins had underestimated the resilience of the Ulysses crew, but now their final gambit was about to unfold. "I'm on my way, Sergeant," she said, her voice steel-sharp with determination. She started to sprint, ignoring the ache in her legs, ignoring the desperate voice of reason that urged her to stop. The core was still out there, still a threat. The hallways grew narrower as she moved deeper into the vessel's heart. Every step felt like a betrayal of her tired body, but Hayes pushed forward. She passed the remains of the central communication relay, once a symbol of human progress, now a heap of twisted metal and shattered screens. Her mind briefly wandered to the faces of her fallen comrades, the soldiers who had given their lives so that others might live. Each memory stung like a bitter wound, but it only served to fuel her determination. Finally, she reached the chamber that housed the core. It was larger than she remembered. An immense crystalline structure suspended in the air, pulsing with unnatural energy. Sparks of energy crackled around it, as though the core was alive and struggling to break free from the confines of the ship. The walls of the chamber had buckled from the explosion earlier, leaving gaping holes through which the faint starlight filtered in. But the core was still intact, still glowing, still deadly. Hayes approached cautiously, her eyes locked onto the pulsating energy. The core was unstable, but the power it radiated was undeniable. It had the ability to destroy worlds. It had already done so once, and if she didn't stop it now, the Ulysses would be nothing but a memory. "Reed," Hayes spoke into the comms again, her voice low and steady. "I need you to get everyone to the escape pods. We're going to have to abandon the ship. I can't stop the core from exploding, but if we launch the pods, we might have a chance." Another long pause. Reed's voice returned, but it was tinged with desperation. "Captain, are you sure about this? The core, it's not just going to explode, it's going to take everything down with it. We can't just—" "I'm not asking for your permission, Reed," Hayes snapped, cutting him off. "I'm giving you an order. Get them to the pods. I'll handle the rest." With a final, resolute click, she cut the connection. There was no more time to waste. Hayes was going to end this, one way or another. She stepped closer to the core, her mind focusing on the control terminal at the center. It was a relic from a time before the Harkins had taken control of the ship, a piece of technology left behind by the Ulysses' original engineers. But Hayes had learned its function through sheer willpower and endless hours of study. It was the only way to deactivate the core before it could consume everything around her. She inserted the keycard into the terminal's interface, watching as the screen flickered to life. Her fingers trembled as she typed in the override codes. The data flowed in front of her like a river of numbers, lines of code flashing by in a blur. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she continued to punch in commands, knowing every keystroke was a step closer to their survival or their end. The hum of the core grew louder, and the flashes of energy became erratic. The countdown was imminent. Hayes felt the ship shudder beneath her feet, as if the Ulysses itself was resisting her every move. The walls around her began to collapse, and she could hear the distant roar of escaping air as the hull began to breach. Just as Hayes entered the final command, the core erupted in a violent burst of light, blinding her momentarily. She stumbled backward, shielding her eyes as the vessel groaned in agony. Then, everything went dark. The unseen battle. The blackness was suffocating, like a shroud enveloping Hayes. Her mind drifted, lost in the void of unconsciousness. She felt weightless, like she was floating in a dream, caught between life and death. The last thing she remembered was the flash, the explosion. The core had gone critical, but had she succeeded? Had she truly stopped it from detonating? Her thoughts were a tangle of confusion and pain as she regained fragments of consciousness. A cold draft touched her skin, and a high-pitched ringing filled her ears. Slowly, her vision returned in fragments, a blurry silhouette, the faint outline of walls, the distant hum of machinery. But something was off. The air felt wrong, faintly metallic, like the remains of a shattered world. She blinked rapidly, her eyes trying to focus on the world around her. The once mighty Ulysses was gone. Her heart sank as she took in the wreckage surrounding her. Torn metal, cracked floors, sparks that jumped from broken conduits. The ship was barely holding together, its once powerful systems now crippled beyond recognition. Hayes pushed herself up, her body aching as she slowly stood. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. She had to know. Had she done enough? Had she saved them? The walls around her groaned under the strain, threatening to collapse at any moment. The core, though, was silent, no longer humming with destructive power. There was nothing but the quiet. "Reed?" Her voice was weak, hoarse, but she forced it to carry through the comms. A long pause followed, and then the voice of Sergeant Marcus Reed crackled back through the static, barely audible. "Captain, is that you? You're alive. We thought you were gone." "I'm here," Hayes replied, relief flooding her chest. "We stopped it, Reed. The core's gone. The Harken vessel is down." There was a long silence on the other end, before Reed's voice broke through once again, louder now, as if he had been holding his breath. "Captain, you've done it. I can't believe it. The Harkens are down. We've confirmed the fleet has begun retreating. We've won." Hayes closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of the words. It was over. The fight was done. She had done it. They had done it. They had held the line long enough to change the course of history. But the feeling of victory wasn't what she had imagined. The adrenaline that had carried her through the chaos now gave way to a deep sense of exhaustion and loss. "Good," Hayes said, her voice quieter now. "But we still need to get out of here." Reed's voice grew frantic. I'm trying, Captain. The escape pods, they're failing. The blast caused more damage than we anticipated. We've only got a few left, and the rest of us are stuck on this hellhole of a ship." Hayes winced at his words. The Ulysses was far from salvageable. Every inch of it was a death trap. But the surviving crew needed to escape, and they had only one chance to get it right. "Get to the secondary hangar bay," Hayes instructed, her voice growing firm despite her body's protest. "I'll find you. We'll make it out together. Just hang on, Reed. We're not done yet." She moved quickly, her instincts taking over as she navigated the wreckage of the ship. Each step was laborious, but her determination kept her going. She had to reach the survivors. She couldn't afford to lose any more of them. As she made her way through the winding corridors, Hayes saw the true extent of the damage. The ship was barely holding together, chunks of its structure torn away by the earlier explosion. She could feel the tremors beneath her feet, the instability of the hull threatening to break apart with every passing second. The Harken's invasion force had been repelled, but the victory had come at a steep price. The ship's emergency lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She reached the main access hatch that led to the hangar bay, but as she tried to open it, a wave of panic surged through her. The door was jammed. It wouldn't budge. "Reed," she called out again. "Reed, do you copy? I need you to get to the auxiliary control station. We have to open this door." "I can't." "I'm on it, Captain." Reed's voice interrupted, filled with urgency. "Hang tight. We'll get you through." For what felt like an eternity, Hayes waited. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with the constant rumble of the ship's failing systems. The light above her flickered, casting her shadow across the hallway like a ghost. Finally, after what seemed like an impossible delay, the door released with a loud hiss, and Hayes rushed through, pushing her way toward the hangar bay. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the ship's corridors, a reminder that time was running out. She reached the hangar bay to find the crew gathered, disheveled and weary, but alive. Reed was standing near the last remaining pod, his face lined with exhaustion, but alive with the thrill of survival. "Captain," he shouted, his voice echoing in the vast hangar. "We made it." Hayes nodded, a tired smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Good work, Sergeant. Now, let's get out of here." The escape pods were packed, their engines sputtering as they were launched into space one by one. Hayes couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as the final pod was launched, its hatch ceiling shut with a thud. The ship was falling apart, its destruction imminent, but they had made it. "Reed, you're the last one," Hayes said, her voice softening. He met her gaze with a solemn expression. "You're coming too, right?" Hayes hesitated for a moment. She had led them all through the battle, guided them to victory, but now it was time for her to let go. She had fulfilled her duty. "Go," Hayes said, her tone firm. "I'll stay behind. Make sure the others are safe. They'll need you." Reed's eyes filled with protest, but Hayes shook her head. "I've done what I needed to. Now it's your turn to live." There was a moment of silence between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Reed nodded, reluctantly but with respect. "I'll never forget you, Captain." With a final salute, Reed entered the pod, sealing it shut as it rocketed into the starry expanse of space. Hayes stood alone in the wreckage of the Ulysses, watching as the last of her crew escaped. As the ship's core finally gave out, the Ulysses burst into flames, its remains disintegrating into the vastness of space. Hayes watched it burn, feeling the heat in her chest. The battle was over. Humanity had won, but at an unimaginable cost. The universe was vast, and there were still countless battles ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Hayes felt a sense of peace. They had won. And, in the end, that was enough. Epilogue. Legacy of the Ulysses. Years later, the story of Captain Hayes and the Ulysses would be remembered as one of the greatest moments in humanity's struggle for survival. Her sacrifice, her leadership, and her unwavering resolve became the stuff of legend. Monuments would be erected in her honor, and her name would echo across history as a beacon of hope. But for those who survived, there would be no glory in remembering. There would only be the quiet knowledge that in the dark hours of humanity's greatest trial, they had fought together and had survived. And that was something no enemy could ever take away.